Good evening. Welcome to Q&A. I'm Tony Jones, answering your questions tonight. Former host of The Project, comedian Charlie Pickering. Former Immigration Minister Philip Ruddock. Cape York Indigenous leader Tanya Major. Tim Hawkes, the principal of the King's School and author of 10 Conversations You Must Have With Your Son. And the Deputy Leader of the Opposition, Tanya Plibersek. Please welcome our panel. Q&A is simulcast on ABC News 24 and News Radio. You can join the Twitter conversation using the Quanda hashtag. And remember, if you have a live question, add @Quanda to help us find it. Well, we asked our Facebook followers what we should talk about on Q&A this week. They nominated domestic violence, asylum seekers and Indigenous education as priorities. We'll come to those soon. But our first question comes from William Broome.
Hello, Tony. Hello, panel. Does the panel believe that somebody's sexuality, in light of the Ian Thorpe interview, is nobody's business? Or do people, particularly in the public eye, have a duty to come out to make it easier and to enable younger people, or people of all ages, to come out and break any boundaries of homophobia?
Charlie Pickering, let's start with you.
I'm not making an announcement.
Unless you feel like it.
I don't think it's anyone's right to say that anyone should or should not need to communicate their sexuality to the world. I don't think anyone should feel obliged to communicate their sexuality to the world. That said, I feel nothing but happy for Thorpe, feeling comfortable enough to come out. I also feel a bit almost heartbroken that he felt for so long that he couldn't.
Is it clear to you why he felt that?
Why he felt that he couldn't? No, I think only he would know in a very detailed way, and it'd be almost impossible to communicate with words, even in a long-form interview or anything like that. I think Australia has changed significantly since he was a 15-year-old world champion, since he won gold medals at the 2000 Olympics. Australia is moving towards being more understanding, but, I mean, if I can remember correctly, Mr Ruddock, you introduced the legislation to ban same-sex marriage in this country, and that was not long after the Olympics, where Thorpe was a national hero, but in his own country laws were being passed that would disenfranchise him, that would mean that his relationship, whatever it was, would not be treated the same as anyone else. And God, I wouldn't want to put up my hand in that environment. I would feel very intimidated if my country had laws that didn't recognise my relationship equally.
Philip Ruddock, do you want to respond to that?
Well, the only point,
obviously to the question.
No, the first point I would make is that I am opposed to any form of discrimination, and it's whether it's race, sexuality, like matters. The question about marriage, I think, is a different question. The fact that you don't want to see people discriminated against in their life and the way in which they live it doesn't mean that in relation to marriage, which has a particular purpose, that you should fundamentally change the nature of it.
But the questioner asks, just to go back to that, whether people with a high profile like Ian Thorpe have a kind of duty to talk about their sexuality rather than to, in a way, mislead people about it, as he did for a long time.
Well, I don't know that you have a duty to disclose anything, but I don't know that you have an obligation to hide it. I certainly wouldn't think that people should be so obliged. I mean, for me, I've employed people who are gay. I've got friends who are gay. I've got relatives who are gay. I am not judgmental about those matters.
So how would their marriage be different to another marriage?
Because
you've worked with them, you've been up close, you know.
Well, no, I think that marriage was ordained in that sense to provide a basis for the nurturing of children primarily. And while it is argued that the expectation that there should be role models, both male and female, in those sorts of relationships obviously don't apply where somebody's widowed. And if there are people who come together who want to have children and you know, sometimes when people reorganise their affairs, as they do, because of the change in circumstances, children are in those relationships. It doesn't mean that you have to fundamentally change the nature of marriage itself, it seems to me.
Philip Ruddock, I'll steer away from gay marriage for the moment. Just stick with the question, Tanya.
I'd just like to say good on him. I mean, his sexuality is his own business. It's not my business, given that he's a high-profile Australian. But I think the important issue here is the fact that mental illness and depression, and a lot of our young people are struggling with that, and that at the forefront with his profile, bringing across mental illness and depression is more important than his sexuality, and that services and programs and support services should be in place for young people rather than worrying about whether he's gay or not. I mean, I'm black, I'm a woman. If I only had a disability and I'd be lesbian, I'd tick all minority groups.
Tim Hawkes.
I'm delighted that Thorpe has laid his demons to rest. At least I hope he has, Tony. But I think that there has been a missed opportunity. I think if Thorpe...
On his part.
On his behalf. When I think of the sort of the positive influence he could have had on so many young people who are struggling with this issue. It's all very well now, him coming out, and I'm glad he has. But look, you can't criticise anyone unless you've walked a mile in their shoes, and trust me, his shoes are huge, and I couldn't walk in those. But it's very easy to carp and criticise from the side. But you know, if he'd come out a little earlier and not particularly written this book, you know, his book, you know, This Is Me, well, it's not me. And in there, he sort of says, I get really upset that people criticise and suggest that I might be a closet gay. And he gets really upset about that. And he says, you know, if I was, I'd come out and say so. So I find that element of duplicity a little disappointing. And I also, to be honest, when I was reading today, that one of the reasons why he hadn't come out earlier had to do with money, and I just, that's not a really good reason. And you know, the fact that he picked up 400K, you know, for doing the Parkinson interview as well, it didn't go down too well. I think there are probably other arenas, other opportunities for him to have come out a little earlier. And gee, that would have had a wonderful impact. As it is, it's still a good impact. He's still being brave, I think. But it would have been, I think for me, I would have loved him to have been honest a little earlier.
Let me ask you about this. One of the 10 conversations you must have with your son is about helping boys find out who they are. I mean, do you encourage young gay men at the King's School to come out, and are there support groups for them, or is there a support network if they do?
Well, we certainly have support. It is interesting that certainly there have been one or two occasions. I remember a boy who had been struggling with this issue and of his own sexuality, and he was becoming rebellious and non-compliant, and therefore his shadow came across my study floor, together, I might just say, with that of his parents. And he was being fairly difficult, and then all of a sudden he blurted out, "I'm gay!" And we looked at him and we said, "Yeah, well, we've suspected that for some time, but what's the problem? What's your problem?" And I think that's so, it's so important to be accepting of different people's sexuality. And there's no question.
Is one of the problems that he might actually get bullied at school?
Well, I think there is always that fear. And there is no question that remains one of the blights of society. And certainly I've also helped parents deal with it, and I give them the hug, thank and go mantra. So hug them, say thank you, and hug them, and then thank your son for sharing that you know, that raw honesty with you, and then probably go for a little, you know, walk the dog for about 10 minutes, lest you say something which you may regret. Go and lower the meniscus of a single malt or something for 10 minutes, and then reconnect and talk about the past. For how long have you been feeling this way? Just a factual acquisition. Talk about the present, how you're feeling now. And talk about the future. You know, how is it that we're going to tell your sister, and so on. And I think those sorts of, that bit of scaffolding can really help when you're dealing with a difficult and sensitive issue like this, Tony.
Tanya Plibersek.
Well, two things, I think. I think what a bunch of knockers we are that this young man's done this incredibly brave thing. Great swimmer, articulate young man, gorgeous. Comes out and tells a secret that he's kept for so long, and half the people are going, "Oh, he should have said it sooner." Oh, what a bunch of knockers. I think it's terrific. I think it's terrific that he's had the confidence to do it now. I'm so sorry we live in a society that as a young teenager he felt he couldn't do it, but I don't blame someone who in their very early teens is thrust into the public spotlight, takes a position and then gets into a sort of cycle of defending the position that they've taken. It is so completely explicable in a society that has so much discrimination and bullying and violence towards gay men and lesbians, transgender, bisexual, intersex people, that someone would not feel that they're comfortable disclosing, and it is nobody else's business. I think he's a great role model. He's always been a great role model. He's gone up in my estimation for being so brave now, and I think anybody who's knocking him should take a chill pill.
I'm just going to go back to our question. I think when you... Sorry.
I agree with Tanya. I believe it's nobody's business, and I do not believe anybody has a duty to come out. But when they do, I think it helps people come out. It breaks the boundaries of homophobia. And I want to live in a society where it's no longer front page news, where coming out is no longer a big deal, where it's just part of everyday life, and where there's no speculation about people's sexuality, and they don't feel they have to stay in the closet or under any pressure to come out of the closet. When we live in that world, we've made true progress.
OK, well, that's a good point to move on to our next question. Thank you very much. Which is from Leonie Juice.
Thank you, Tony. Tim Hawkes, you suggest that schools neglect to teach basic living skills. If schools are not addressing these topics, and many parents do not have the skills or confidence to handle this in isolation, how do we achieve this?
Well, it's a great question, and certainly I would agree that I think we've got a problem. I think that today, with so many accountability measures in schools, things like my school websites and so on and so forth, HSC league tables and Year 12 examination league tables and so on, the great temptation is for schools to teach towards that which is publicly examined and reported on. And I think this is leading to a manifest betrayal of our students in our schools. And how is it, for example, if money is meant to make the world go round, how is it that we allow anyone to leave school without some basic training in literacy, in financial literacy, credit card management, and so on and so forth? And I think also the instances of domestic dyslexia are extraordinary. And we've certainly, King's introduced an Ironman competition, and it's with the iron, you know, and the prize is an iron, which has all been engraved and so on. But I think, in answer to your question, we need to to tackle this in partnership with the home. The principal people to be giving this instruction are the mums and dads. And one of the things that I've certainly tried to do in my book, 10 Conversations You Must Have With Your Son, is to empower mums and dads and to encourage them and say, listen, you've got wisdom, you've blown out the candles of many cakes, you've picked up the stories, the anecdotes, the experiences, and that's gold. And for goodness sake, create those times so that you can share that wisdom with your sons and your daughters. Don't suggest it's the school's job. You actually have some great stories, great wisdom, great experiences, great recipes, great hints on what to do with or without the starch, and so on and so forth. And I think we need to do that. But I think in order to help, we've got to create those times of communion and connection. And so families dining together, creating that conversation pit, if you like, around the dining room table. The car is a wonderful place for conversations. Ban the buds in the ears with the wires dribbling out, and let that be a time of colloquy and conversation and discourse. Let that be a time of chatting. How are you going? And just listening to your kids. I mean, how important is that? The best conversations are absolute silence sometimes. And the pressures of talking about the trivial and laughter, which are so important to build the bridge which is necessary for good and those heavy conversations. If you want to take something heavy across, you've got to build a strong bridge, and that bridge is built up with sufficient, which is trivial and fun, and time spent with your children. So much of it, I think, is that.
Okay, I'm going to I would actually like to hear from some of the other panellists on this. And Tanya Major, I mean, is these sort of things true of schools in remote Indigenous communities equally as they might be true in the King's School?
Definitely. My work involves working primarily with parents. The biggest issues that we're facing currently is the federal government looking at compliance-driven, all bums on seats, all kids go to school. And I believe it's more than just bums on seat and counting numbers, it's actually the outcome. Are these kids actually learning? And before you even go there, you've got to question, why aren't these kids going to school and working with the parents? And I believe it actually starts with the parents. So you're educating the parents around, I love NAPLAN. So they actually have a bigger picture of where their kids are at nationally and bringing them along. And so therefore they're valuing education to break the intergenerational cycle of illiteracy and numeracy. And I think education doesn't necessarily encapsulate literacy and numeracy. It's holistic. It's drawing it out of the individual and working around leadership, working around financial management, working around building hopes, aspirations and dreams. And in the communities that I actually work in, this doesn't exist. I'm working with parents. The majority, well, the average characteristics of the parents that I'm engaged in, their literacy and numeracy is between year 3 and 5. So how do you expect a parent with low literacy to value employment training or training that leads to employment? And let alone making sure that your kids go to school when all their lives education have failed them, whereas the characteristics around resilience, family, the values are not embedded in the education that these kids are getting because of low literacy, education full stop, the social fabric of these communities, the entrenched poverty and welfare in these communities. So I honestly believe you've got to start with the parents and bring the parents along to work at their level to engage the kids and making sure that the kids have a dream to aspire to.
Tanya, we're going to come back to that subject in more detail. And Charlie Pickering, I know you're about to have a child fairly soon. If your child is a son, what's the one conversation you would like to have with him?
Congratulations on becoming President of Australia, son. That would be... For you to follow in my footsteps, it means so much.
Barack Pickering.
Yeah.
You're just encouraging me to be mischievous. You don't want him to be the Queen of Australia.
No. No.
What large skills?
I choose not to plan any conversations with my future child. I think my future child will probably dictate those. But it's funny talking about how we approach education systems, and I think we need to take it back to a conversation about what do we want our education system to do? What's its job for our country and for our children individually as a group? And I think too much of the conversation about education over the last couple of years has been how can we demonstrate on a website something's improving, or how can we point out that they said they'd spend the same money as us but they're not spending the same money as us, or in the realm of politics, I've forgotten the last time I heard a constructive conversation saying, what should this education system do and how can we invest in it so that it does that job? And there is just this too much conversation about education costing too much. And if you don't put money in education, you cannot afford the consequences that happen down the track.
Can I say, I actually think that the whole of the Gonski School education funding reform was about that very conversation, because it was saying education is the greatest opportunity we have for individuals to break out of poverty, to change their life experience, but it's also the most important investment we can make as a nation to continue to increase our productivity, to grow our wealth as a nation. And one of the things that was really critical to the funding model was actually having loadings for students from an Indigenous background, non-English speaking background, from small schools, from remote schools with a disability, because we know that the public education system actually looks after most of those students, and we know that they're missing out on the quality of education that they should be getting. So I know that it's very easy to say, oh, all this crap about the funding model, who wants to talk about, dollars and cents? It is really important that the school system is resourced and that the kids who need the most help get the most funding. That's not the only thing, it's not sufficient in itself, but it is really important. And I'm really interested that Tanya talked about loving NAPLAN, because it's, again, very easy to dismiss testing as unimportant. But I'll tell you something, Glebe Public School in my electorate, fantastic school, serves mostly public housing kids, has one of the best value adds of any school in New South Wales, in fact of any school in Australia. You can see the improvement of those kids. Many of them come from home environments where there's not a lot of books around. Their parents may have had a bad experience with education, but in that school, their literacy and their numeracy improves out of sight. And NAPLAN tells you that. The sort of prejudices that people have, that they say this school that serves a largely public housing area, that couldn't possibly be the right school for my kid to go to, those prejudices can't stand in the face of real data. So it is important to have data, and it is important to have transparency, and it is important, once you know where the funding should go to do the most good, that the funding actually goes to where it should do the most good.
Okay, let's hear from Philip Ruddock. I mean,
As a parent, and I've had girls who have been very high achievers and have done very well. But it's not one size fits all. I mean, that's one of the difficulties that we have in our society, that at times people think within the education system, the teaching system is going to make up for what they see as being the shortcomings of the parents. And I have some difficulty in accommodating a view that teachers should know more than we do about what should be done for our children. And yet there are other children where the families are not able to offer the support and encouragement that they need.
So what about the whole idea that you need to have a new look at the way equity works in Australian schools? It was raised by both Charlie and Tanya.
Well, I'm not sure what you mean by equity, Tony. I mean, in the sense that...
I think we're talking about a brand new funding model based upon equity.
Yeah, well, if what you think is that money is the ultimate determinant of a good education, I think that's a very narrow view. I think that it's the way in which you undertake the process of educating that is fundamentally more important than just the nature and quality of buildings and surrounds and additional amenity and so on.
That's very easy to say when you're not talking about a school that is struggling for basic resources, Philip. Like, yes, money is not everything. Teacher quality is the most important determinant in the quality of education a kid gets. But if the kids don't... I mean, you made fun of the Building the Education Revolution, but this put electronic whiteboards in classrooms across Australia for the first time. It upgraded facilities that had been run down for 30 or 40 years. For the first time, decent money going into upgrading the facilities that most of our kids use. And no, it's not everything, but it is something. And if you underfund the school system, that shows.
Well, I'm not about underfunding the school system, but what I would say is that it cannot be demonstrated that the additional amounts of money have produced the sorts of quantitative improvements in the educational outcome that I would have liked to see. And I think there are issues surrounding curriculum and the way in which the education process is undertaken.
So we'll fix that.
I'm going to move on because we've actually got a question which takes us to part of this area. It's how Indigenous schools in remote communities work, and it's from Bruce Taylor.
Tony. Tanya Major, you've put forward a model of that challenges traditional attendance for Indigenous students in primary schools. I've been an educator for the last 21 years, and I've taught in schools in New South Wales and in the Northern Territory with Indigenous populations. I've been a literacy consultant, I've been a specialist teacher, and I've supported teachers in the development of literacy intervention, which is daily. I've personally seen the gains that children experience by attending school daily. Can you explain to us how your model can improve student outcomes for Indigenous students if they're not attending daily, and also for all students?
Well, that's actually a really good question. my research on the ground, I've been in the community for 4.5 years, working primarily with parents. As I said before, the average parent in these communities have a literacy between year 3 and year 4. What I love about NAPLAN testing is when I'm in these communities, I do workshops with the parents to actually show the parents where their year 3, well, primarily their year 7 students are at in compared to national across Australia. And these kids are in year 3 literacy and numeracy. And I explained to parents that this is actually a skills test. These kids then go off to boarding school into a year 8 curriculum and year 8 environment. What chance does an Aboriginal child from a remote community have to go on to year 12 into a year 8 environment with a year 3 literacy and numeracy? And my question is around NAPLAN testing in the education system, that these kids, primary school is the foundation in order for these kids to either get into job or training, etc., or future prospects in the future. And so by explaining to parents where they're at nationally, it gives them an insight to then sit there and go, wow. So if my child drops out in year 8, what is the inevitable cycle of this child? Well, the inevitable cycle is this child cannot complete school, they drop out, they go back into the community at 13 years old, they're not back registered in the state education system, and the state education system is passing these children, even though NAPLAN testing is clearly showing that these kids do not have the skills. There should be a prerequisite in order for these kids, and that's a federal government issue. The state government are passing them on to the federal government, and I've had this conversation with Minister Scullion, showing him how fabulous, I think, for a long time, Aboriginal academic and testing has been hidden. And NAPLAN has been clear in the community and helping parents get up there. And so, long story short, the kid goes back into the community, not re-engaged because of the failure of thinking that they're dumb, and it's a self-hate and a self-confidence, and it's a self-esteem issue, become pregnant. And then a 13-year-old is on welfare for life. What's the human and long-term financial cost for that 13-year-old who has a kid? And what are the chances of that kid in the future? And so that's the kind of work
to take you back to the point. Well, actually, that's the question is going to do that himself. Go ahead.
I appreciate what you're trying to say, and I've lived in some of those communities, but I don't think you're understanding the importance of the early acquisition of literacy and numeracy skills for infants and primary school students. And teach a class of 26 7-year-olds right now.
Look, I
daily
definitely
attendance
understand
is
you.
Crucial for those children
Definitely, but we
in
need to
order to
understand the
attain those
parents.
skills that you're trying to say they're missing out on and their parents don't have.
Okay, well,
so if you're not,
let's settle.
I just can't agree with you. I cannot agree with
like
you.
you.
Just hang on for one second. Can we settle this one?
Sorry.
No,
As
don't
an
be sorry.
educationalist,
Bring it on.
I cannot agree with you.
Well, can we just settle one
I'm
point?
not here to be agreed.
Yeah.
So you're not actually saying that compulsory schooling is absolutely wrong, are you? And I think that's where the misunderstanding
Yeah,
lies. From what I understand is you're saying it's not working because the building blocks are not there. Is that correct?
I think that's absolutely right.
That's exactly absolutely right in what I'm saying. I'm saying that compliance-driven models don't work. In that context, and it's about stepping in and asking the mother and the father, well, why aren't you sending your child to school?
And I've read a fair bit of Tanya's work, and one of the things she's very strong on is, in fact, the importance of early schooling, and she's absolutely right. I mean, if we don't get children on a trajectory of learning in those early formative years, we've lost the plot. You're playing catch-up education. And some of the terrific work that Tanya is doing and others in Indigenous areas, I think, relate to there being a communion between the student and the teachers and the parents. And when you've got all three in accord, wanting growth and academic advancement, you're going to move and move to a good place. And Tanya's absolutely right. The biggest control on educational outcome. This one, I'm just doing this one.
Sorry.
Tanya Major and Tanya Minor, both right.
Major and Minor. Both in yellow, both looking fabulous. In yellow. Just saying. But,
We obviously didn't
but the biggest variable in educational outcomes is the quality of the teacher. There's no question of that. And in that sense, I think Philip is absolutely right. Money by itself is not necessarily going to change things. It's money with quality teaching, with good accountability. We haven't mentioned that tonight, but certainly I know that Tanya does in some of her writings, where there's actually got to be decent accountability. And a certain degree, interestingly enough, of rigour. You're wanting rigour as well for those Indigenous communities.
Let me go to Tanya Minor, as she likes to call herself now. Wait, can I just ask you this? If it's actually the case that a lot of kids in these communities are getting through primary school but not having attained Year 6 standards, but only Year 2 or 3 standards, they will never make it in high school, will they?
And when we came to government, you would never have known that. Actually, there was no data that would have told you that. I think it is really important for kids to turn up. They'll never learn if they're not turning up in school. But the quality of the education they get when they're there and the involvement of the parents is equally critical. And there's a lot of pre-schooling programs, well, not a lot, there's a few excellent ones, like the hippie program, the home interaction where the parents become the first educators of the child. Fantastic program, builds the confidence of the parent, makes sure the kid's ready for school when they go to school. And teachers tell you that they know which kids have been through the hippie program because they start enthusiastic, hungry to learn. And usually it's the mothers that are the home educators. They say, I had a terrible experience at school and I didn't want my child to go through that same cycle. That's why I've done this program. There's also, I think, programs where the grandmothers in particular, but elders go to the school with the kids, making sure that the kids are feeling comfortable at school as well, making sure that attendance is there, regularity of the habit going to school. You'll never learn if you're not there, but it's not enough, you're right, Tanya, to say just turning up. You'll suck the information in. And that's not what you're saying either.
That's not what I'm saying
You're
either.
saying you need a quality education.
That's right.
But the kids need to be there.
Can I just...
I taught a class where a child missed 85 days of kindergarten.
Hang on, we might put you on the panel next week, but right now, I'd like to hear from Tanya Major. What did you conclude out of this? If kids are going to high school, and I think this happened to you as well, without the requisite skills to actually be in high school, how do you fix this problem?
Well, what we're actually doing is I honestly conclude that the state government need to take responsibility here. And instead of passing these kids, I mean, NAPLAN testing is primarily about these kids' skills. And it helps the parent and it helps the teacher. And the focus should be making sure that that kid who's in Year 7, who's in Year 3 testing skills, should be in Year 7 before they exit off to boarding school to get a mainstream education. And through the work I'm doing through the Major Impact Foundation is looking at alternative pathways for lost youth, unskilled adults and families. And it's holistic. And making sure that these kids have the pathway to go to King's College, but have the academic, both English and academic knowledge to go to King's College and aspire to go to schools like that, but providing that we give that kid the opportunity and the desire for education.
So are you saying that you'd actually have to change the amount of resources that are available so that if a child reaches Year 6 but doesn't have the skills to go to high school, you have to keep them back until they do? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, well, what I'm saying, Tony, is the government should give me money to do that.
Well, let's ask Philip Ruddock if he'll do that.
Can I just add
hang on for 1 second.
The part that I was particularly interested in Tanya's writing was about the importance of mentoring and having others who were prepared to help and assist. And in the case of my own family, one of my daughters has taken time outside her work obligations to actually go with Indigenous young people and work with them on getting better outcomes. And where the parents may not be able to offer that assistance, there are others there who are wanting to pick that up. And it's not a matter of just putting it off to the government, it's a matter of ensuring that there is an understanding that there is a need for this, and mentoring and volunteering to help and assist, I think, is something that is very positive and very valuable.
Mentoring needs to be independent of government because government makes sure in their programs actually mentor individuals and young people to meet their outcomes or outputs per se. The work I've done is actually supporting the individual, not you know, everybody across every blackfella in Australia, but supporting the individual and looking at human potential, igniting hope, and also helping the institutions understand what paradox this kid's operating in.
All right, I'm going to move on. Sorry, yes, of course, sorry, I beg your pardon.
I think one of the really key things that we can do is make sure that preschool education is really good. And in all of the Closing the Gap areas, one of the commitments was that every 4-year-old in Australia should have access to preschool education. That commitment is on track to be met, and that will make a huge difference as well.
Okay, it's time to move along. We did promise we would get to other issues, including domestic violence, and we've got a question on that subject from Anthony Gabrias.
My question is about, thank you very much, Tony. My question is about domestic violence. It is said that every week one Australian woman is killed by domestic violence. And recently, a young woman, originally from Ethiopia, is killed in Auburn by her husband. What is being done on this chronic and rampant problem?
I'll start with Charlie Pickering here. You've written about this.
Yes, what's being done about this problem? Not enough yet. We're moving in that direction. I think the national conversation is starting to occur. But you're right, a woman dies every week. It's actually slightly north of that. It's around 70 women a year die at the hands of a partner. And if this were a level crossing, we would be all guns blazing, battle stations. We've got to stop this level crossing, killing pedestrians. But because it happens behind closed doors, because it's wives or partners, why aren't we doing anything about it? And it's not as simple as saying we have to fix this problem. We have a cultural problem in this country if that is occurring. So that starts with educators, it starts with parents. It starts with members of communities that see violence occurring and don't say anything. It is time to say something. It is time to get involved. Because we as a culture, nationally, have a problem with this. And we as a culture have to solve it. If you want to break it down to economics, it's costing us easily $8 to $10 billion a year.
13.6.
13.6, there you go. Tanya's much more across the numbers than I am. So if you don't want to have a compassionate bone in your body, just do it for the money. But as a culture, we should be ashamed of ourselves for where we're at. And the attention that we give to issues that shouldn't be issues when this is affecting people in all of our lives. Everyone in this room, someone you know is touched by this. So it's not a problem that's someone else's issue. It's all of our problem and we all have to do something about it.
Philip Ruddock, you hear what's being said here, and this is a province of government, isn't it, really? If a government decided to make this a major issue and put it on the top of the list, something would change, wouldn't it?
Well, the government did announce this week that it was focused on these issues, and there has been a statement about it. I mean, there is no place for domestic violence, and I think I certainly accept that is the case, and I think the points that are made, that the community as a whole should be focused on this issue. We do have a situation where the courts can be engaged if people are afraid that they may be impacted. You can get orders in relation to apprehended violence, but they're not easy issues to deal with because you're dealing with individuals, you're dealing with family situations, often breakdown of family, which are extraordinarily difficult to manage. But I think the point that's been made about having a community that's aware of it, a community that's prepared to be outspoken on it, say something about it when they see it, and to support those who are affected by it is fundamental.
Can I say something just quickly about the courts? This is the first time I realised the scale of the problem we face as a nation. I had to attend the Heidelberg Magistrates Court for a minor traffic infringement. And when I was there, I noticed that there were 2 reception desks. One was for all criminal matters and the other was for domestic violence issues. So they had to build a second desk to deal with the volume of domestic violence problems. And I saw that. I just couldn't believe that is what we're dedicating our criminal justice system to, and it's not meeting the demand, and that scale is there, but we're not talking about it often enough.
Tanya Major.
I actually would just clearly like to say domestic violence is more than the physical violence and scars that women wear on their face. A lot of the people I work with, a lot of psychological violence as well and psychological abuse. And so, again, what clearly shows to me is the intergenerational issues and the intergenerational, how it's passed down through family. And it's not an easy fix answer because it is an epidemic. I mean, you've got young boys now who would rather engage in PlayStation shooting zombies and the whole stigma around the cyber world of escalating violence and fear. But I personally think, I've recently got a son and I am concerned about how do I have 10 conversations with my son and how does we condition our family and my child around, do you stand up if you see women being battered? How because, I'm no stranger to violence. I've seen it all around me in my communities. And I just honestly think that it is such a complex issue. How do you tell a woman that she's amazing and she's got a bright future when she turns up the next day with a missing teeth and a black eye when she's supposed to have a job interview, but yet she still goes back to him. And so it is a complex.
Let me go, Tim Hawkes, 10 conversations, but are we failing in the way we're bringing up as a nation, in the way we're bringing up our sons, if this is an epidemic?
Well, I think I totally agree with Charlie. It is a non-trivial issue. We've got to do better. We've got to do better. We've got to honour our women. We've got to honour our partners. We've got to treasure them. And I think it is a multifaceted approach which is needed. There's not just one easy fix. There's no question of that. I think we've got to look at the raunch culture which exists. I think the porn issue is very, very real. Any 3G-enabled phone is going to give children even unfettered access to porn. We have a pornification not just of adults but of teenagers and indeed even tweenagers, and the deliberate use of sex to sell. We're seeing boys who are heavily into hardcore porn and are expecting girlfriends to perform acts which which are totally inappropriate and dehumanise, and that's a real issue. We've got to tackle it there in schools. And Charlie mentioned this. At schools, we've got to tackle this. One of the things that we've got to work out with boys is that they very often have got V8 bodies, but they've got a P-plate mind, and they've got to learn how to drive their bodies. They've got to learn how to handle testosterone, which is an anabolic steroid, for goodness sake. You inject it into swimmers and stuff, and they start throwing tractors around the place and getting into a roid rage. And so we've got to actually teach our boys how to handle testosterone. They get a 600% increase in testosterone as they move into the teenage world, and we've got to teach them things like impulse control, because it was great, the fight-flight thing was great when you were hunting mammoths, but the population of mammoths these days is a little bit thinnish on the ground, and there are other skills we now need. And so this issue is a very real one about impulse control.
Let me go to Tanya Plibersek. Do you see it in that way? Is it a failure of the education of boys, among other things?
I think hormones are an excuse, because all of us can behave ourselves when we need to in particular circumstances, and then we use the hormone excuse, the alcohol excuse, whatever it is, to behave in an appalling way when we think we're going to get away with it. 1 in 3 Australian women will experience domestic violence in her lifetime. 1 in 5 will experience sexual assault. I think you need an approach that comes in 2 ways. The first is to have strong legal prohibitions and a legal system that works to prosecute violence when it happens, to prosecute sexual assault effectively when it happens, preferably to stop it before it happens. But that's where the other prong comes in. You have to have attitudinal change in our community. And Tim's right, that the raunch culture, the objectification of women, the dehumanising of women, of course, contributes to violence against women. We are fooling ourselves if we think that it doesn't. The issue of domestic homicide, for a woman under the age of 45, the single most likely thing to hurt or kill her is the man that she loves. I mean, there is something so profoundly wrong about that. But those two things, the legal response and the attitudinal response, we need to do. Philip's quite right as well. The second phase of the National Plan on Violence Against Women and Their Children was announced last week. It is going in the right direction. I'm happy to say that because it's the direction I established when I was the Minister for Women and part of the 12-year plan that we established at that time. But I'm concerned because there's, for example, a $44 million cut to homelessness services in the last budget. Women have to have a place to go to take their children to be safe when they're facing violence. I think we have made terrific improvements compared with 20 or 30 years ago when police said that's just a domestic. We're not going to attend that. That's a domestic, it's none of our business. Our police force, our courts are much better equipped than they used to be, but we still have in Australia a prevalence of violence that is completely unacceptable.
Okay, there's a lot more we can say about this. Thank you very much, but we are going to move along to other subjects. The next question is from Sophie Nicole.
Hi, my question's to Mr. Ruddock. What do you think about the secrecy around operational matters in the immigration portfolio? If what the Immigration Minister says is true, that silence is being dictated by the Major General. Is it okay that a non-elected military officer is dictating the government's transparency? Shouldn't the Minister be in charge?
Well, I thought there might be a question on this matter. Let me just make the point. I've been at the butt of some of this, and you may or may not remember at an earlier point in time, there was the issue surrounding what was called euphemistically children overboard. And I came to a view as the Minister that I should go quickly to the media when certain questions were put to me. It proved, even though the advice I'd received was to the effect that children had been thrown overboard, in fact it was formed because some people were holding children over the side of a ship, and the people who saw it then saw people in the water, and they reported back to headquarters there were children overboard. That's what was reported.
But Philip Ruddock, can I just say this? It was only because ministers in those days allowed themselves to actually answer questions that we found out what really happened.
No, it arose because after there was time for reflection and examination of what was actually happening, people then knew what I just described to you. But when the initial reports came through, that was not the case. And so
that's a confusion over detail. A question like, is there a boat in the ocean that you've intercepted,
ministers took the
is
view,
pretty straightforward.
No, ministers took the view, and with advice, that it was better for there to be a time to establish precisely what is happening so that you can report accurately on those matters.
Does that mean the Minister does not know if 153 asylum seekers are currently on an Australian boat, on their own boat, or on some other conveyance?
No, I think the issue is, as the Minister says, that there is a degree of trading on knowledge as to what is happening to the extent to which you can encourage trafficking, and that you fuel the traffickers by putting information into the public arena.
If that is the case, then Tony Abbott, with his billboard announcing how many boats had arrived in Australia, was the best friend that people smugglers ever had. And it's a ludicrous level of hypocrisy to say that being silent about it now is a great idea, but before I was elected, I was happy to help the people smugglers as much as possible. I spent a few grand on a billboard.
Well, look, I mean, the point I would make...
No, just, it beggars belief.
No, the point I would make in relation to these issues is that they are very difficult public policy. I spoke recently in a program about these issues for Intelligence Squared, and I made the point very strongly, that I am a Liberal for refugees. I want to see a situation where we don't have people getting on boats, where we don't have people being able to trade in lives, where people who are free enough to travel are able to engage a people smuggler. I want to have a situation in which we can manage that process so that we can help the refugees who really need help.
Okay, but just to go to the point, Philip, can we just go to the questioner's point though? And I suppose the real question here is, are you surprised, given that you were open with the media when you were a minister, relatively, are you surprised that Scott Morrison has been able to get away with this?
No, I think that he made it very clear in the beginning, when the government was elected, that we would be dealing with these issues differently, that we were not going to fuel the people smuggling trade, and that we were going to be able to manage the process. And I think it is quite appropriate for people to reflect on the information they're getting and to be able to inform people accurately at an appropriate time.
Okay, Tanya Plibersek.
Well, I think it's a completely illogical argument too, because if the argument is that it's helping people smugglers, wouldn't the information that the boat's being sent back actually discourage people smuggling? I'm just using your logic. It's a completely illogical argument to say that information about turning boats back encourages people smugglers. But I'd say more generally to this point, I think it is completely unacceptable that the Australian government, using taxpayers' funds, operating in our name, is not prepared to trust the Australian people enough to share this information with us. And I also, the thing that I cannot understand from Philip and others who argued against a regional processing arrangement that would have seen asylum seekers in Malaysia being allowed to work, having access to healthcare and education for their children. They voted against that when we were in government. They now say it's fine for a boat of 153 people to be floating around somewhere in the ocean, and we're not going to tell you, and we don't know what's going to happen to them, and who knows where they'll end up. The lack of consistency there, I find.
I was going to go back to our questioner before we go to the other panellists. Did you have your hand up? I think you did.
I was just going to say I don't think that the government has really sold that story about why being open with the Australian populace about what they're doing, which many of us disagree with, but certainly we have a right to know about, would in any way serve the people smugglers. I certainly can't see how that's the case, and I would agree with what Tanya's just said.
Well,
and
I'd make one further observation in relation to these matters. Part of our dealings has been with Indonesia, and one of the real difficulties the former government had was that in Indonesia, a lot of our statements about what was happening was characterised as megaphone diplomacy. And the Indonesian government became increasingly unwilling to deal with the Australian government when they were learning about decisions that was taken by us.
In this case, and with these people, you're talking about the Sri Lankan government who actually welcomed the idea of returning refugees or asylum seeker boats. Can I just hear from their other panellists?
Worse for some time because of what you're doing. The relationship with Indonesia is seriously
I just want to make some space. We're nearly out of time. I want to make some space for the other panellists to talk about this. Tim Hawkes.
Well, Tony, I worry always about secrecy. I find the motives behind it troubling. I think sometimes there can be good secrecy for operational purposes. I've had little to do with the military, and sometimes you can be entirely compromised if information about your operations is widely known. Some people want that knowledge for political advantage, for political leverage. The media want it, certainly. It fuels their industry. So why do people want this information is certainly... But it's interesting, just listen to the debate. It's often, for me, it's not the information I don't know that worries me, it's the information I do know. Just the thought that there are any children behind the wire, it just appalls me. It absolutely appalls me as a father, as an educator. I want to be able to bring them out. Any people who are being brutalised behind wire, that appalls me. I don't know whether we're achieving a great deal. Certainly in the past we didn't achieve a great deal because most of them ended up in Australia anyway. But guess what? We brutalised them for 5 years.
Just to go back to that point, though, I mean, there are children Yeah, amongst that 153, I think 30-odd children. Do you want to know where they are? Does the government have a responsibility to tell the Australian public?
Well, I think so. It is interesting because, I mean, if you read the reports, you wonder about this boat. I mean, are they actually genuine refugees, or are they, in fact, migrants, economic migrants? I mean, if they were all Tamils, for example, fleeing a government which they felt wasn't particularly sympathetic to them, you'd have a greater deal of sympathy with this particular group. Not that I know all the details of the group, but my understanding is that they're made up of Sinhalese as well as Tamils. My understanding is that some of them could have made the journey to Tamil Nadu in India, which is only 53 kilometres away from Sri Lanka. That's a pretty safe passage for children to make, perhaps, but certainly not a safe passage to move them from there all the way to Australia.
All right, we're nearly out of time. I just want to hear quickly from Tanya Major on this.
I just honestly think, as an Indigenous person, my people would have been standing back on the shore looking at the first fleet of the ships coming in and going, are they really refugees? But the main point I really want to make is that where's the empathy, where's the compassion? I mean, we've got people obviously coming here for a reason. And I just think, how did we become so cruel? And we're talking about people here, and there's every argument for doing the wrong thing, then that doesn't make it right.
Charlie, you want to...
I just wanted to say that the new governor of South Australia, Hugh Van Loo, came here as a refugee on a boat from Vietnam. We had a different policy back then. He is now the governor of South Australia. If he arrived now, we wouldn't even let him into the country. We'd send him to Papua New Guinea and we would forcefully tell him he will never set foot in Australia. I wonder what kind of Australians we're missing out on. But what's going on here is, if you're talking about drowning at sea or boat arrivals, you're talking about symptoms, not the actual problem.
Charlie,
and the problem is that right now there are more displaced people on the planet than at any time in history, except for the end of World War II. The current solution is inefficient. It treats symptoms...
Over 50 million.
Over 50 million.
Over 50 million. And who should we give priority to? Those that who are free enough to travel and are able to come here, as against those who have no capacity to leave. I mean, my concern has always been
But we're looking at refoulement of refugees.
All right. I'm sorry to draw a line under that, but we literally are out of time.
Talk about
That is all we have time for. You can continue that in the green room. Please thank our panel: Charlie Pickering, Philip Ruddock, Tanya Major, Tim Hawkes, and Tanya Plibersek. Thank you. Thank you very much. Now, next week, thousands of scientists, activists and politicians will gather in Melbourne for the 20th International AIDS Conference. And Q&A will be live from Melbourne Town Hall with Françoise Barré-Sinoussi, the Nobel Prize-winning virologist who helped discover HIV, the former High Court Judge Michael Kirby, Howard Government Minister turned commentator Amanda Vanstone, the Indonesian Health Minister Nafsia Mboy, and writer and HIV activist Nick Hollis. Q&A will also be on the road on August 4 when we broadcast from Australia's most significant Indigenous conference, the Garma Festival in northeast Arnhem Land. So we'll finish tonight with a renowned singer from that region, Jeffrey Gurumul Yunupingu, who joins us with his band to sing a new song that roughly translates as "Don't sit around worrying, do something."